I am a native Tucsonan, and my father and mother moved here from Minnesota in the 1940s. One of the first earliest pictures they took of Tucson was standing in front of this church. So Mission San Xavier has been part of my life, and also it's part of the cultural identity of southern Arizona and northern Sonora. It's an icon for people of all faith traditions and people with no faith traditions. And towards the end of my father's life, he became involved with this organization, the Patronato San Xavier. The Patronato is a nonprofit, non-sectarian organization that was founded in 1978 with the goal of restoring this wonderful church and conserving the artwork inside. It many times during the history of this church, many times going back to almost soon after it was abandoned, people predicted this church was on the verge of collapse. Water damage, it had survived an earthquake, it had survived a tornado, it had been hit by lightning. Water was infiltrating the building, destroying the paintings. The towers were on the risk of collapse. And the story of this church is so remarkable, I felt I wanted to be part of telling that story. I've only been on the board for about 5 years, following in my father's footsteps, which makes me a second-generation member of the Patronato. And then recently I've become involved in our docent program, because not only do we have this amazing church, live, active, vibrant church community, but the story of this church and the people who lived here and the people who shaped this church deserves to be told. So I became a docent because I felt awe of the space, awe of this building, and wanted to help convey that to people who come here from basically all over the world, speak many different languages. We have pilgrims, we have worshipers, we have simply people who are just coming for inspiration, for solitude, for contemplation, or simply just to see this magnificent structure. The name St. Francis Xavier was given to this mission by Father Eusebio Francisco Kino, who was a Jesuit missionary, who was invited to this area in 1692 by the native people who lived in this village. It's called San Xavier del Bac, after the village of Wac. And upon his arrival, he found the native people here, but the Jesuits never really established a church building until about the 1750s. And they had a small temporary building. Mud adobe, didn't last very long. After the Jesuits left this area, they were replaced by the Franciscan order. And by then, the 1770s, Spain had extended its territory up to this area, building a presidio in Tucson. The Franciscans then started work on this structure in 1783. And they built the church with borrowed funds. It took them from 1783 to 1797 when they exhausted the funds that they had, and they left the church in an unfinished state. So 1797, the church was in its form that you see today. Shortly after the church was completed, Mexico declared its independence from Spain. Mexico couldn't afford to provide priests to service this church and this community. So by about 1830, 1835, this church was abandoned. It sat abandoned for 50 years, 50, 60 years. There are no priests assigned here. And during the entire time that the church was abandoned, it was protected by the native people who lived here in the village of Wac. And in fact, we have historical documents from people who came through this village in 1830 and 1840, 1850, 1860, all remarking about the reverence that the people of this community had for the church, how they protected it from people who were coming through, how they safeguarded the objects of worship, the vestments, guarded the church from outsiders. And when the priests returned later after the Civil War, they remarked how the people from the village came to greet them. They started ringing the church bells. They knew the songs in Latin. They knew the order of worship. They still knew the prayers, and greeted the priests saying, "We knew that you would return," and had been waiting some 50, 60 years for the return of the fathers. They brought many of the statues that you see in the church out of their homes where they'd held them for safekeeping for 50 to 60 years and reestablished regular worship at this church. One of the things that makes this mission church significant is of the 21 missions that were founded by Father Kino in the 1600s. This is the only church that still serves the native people that he found when he arrived here 325 years ago. I've heard oral stories through the Tohono people, and I've read what the priests wrote and what the Spanish wrote. It's very well documented. I think the credit goes, first of all, to Father Kino when he arrived here in 1692. He came here shortly after the Pueblo Revolt in New Mexico. And when he arrived in this part of the New World, he went to the governor of Sonora and said, I will continue into this uncharted area, the border, the end of Christendom. But he said, I'll come on the condition that I have a document that exempts any native people who come to the mission and convert to the faith from any form of involuntary servitude. So he came with a document that was actually quite controversial in this area. And he had many opponents in the ranching and mining communities who didn't like the idea that the native people would be free to worship and not be required to work in their mines or work in their ranches. But that was one of his conditions for coming up here. He had seen in Baja California where there had been efforts to convert the native people with force, and those had failed spectacularly. And so when he came to this area of the country, he would only go into villages where he was welcomed, where he was accepted. And he was actually invited. The people in this village had heard about this father coming from the south with horses and cattle and wheat and plants and metal implements. They went to find him and brought him up here. And a hallmark of what Father Kino did, he was a staunch defender of the native people. In many circumstances, he defended the native people against the Spanish. And he felt, and he documented this in many of his writings, that the way to bring people to faith is simply by treating them like adults, explaining faith to them, explaining the church, explaining the doctrines. He felt that there was no point in trying to force people to convert to a religion that they did not accept. And interestingly enough, in the Tohono O'odham culture and the Catholic faith, there are many stories that can be blended together. And we know that the Jesuits were very good at taking traditional native ways and combining them with the Catholic faith. And in fact, one of the central stories of the Tohono O'odham people is the story of I'itoi, who is called the elder brother. And the story that is told by the Tohono O'odham people is that I'itoi was sent by the Creator, his father, to the earth. He'd made people out of dirt to come to the Tohono O'odham people and teach them how to live in harmony with the desert and how to live in harmony with each other. And once I'itoi felt that he had taught that lesson to the native people, he then ascended back to the sacred mountain Babakivri, where he still watches over the native people. So the Jesuits, hearing these stories, felt, well, we can blend these into the Christian faith. We can tell the stories of the Bible through the stories. And both with the Jesuits and with the Franciscans, there was a tremendous respect for the native traditions, the native culture ways. And so there was an effort to incorporate those and not say one is preferred over the other. So in many aspects, both the Franciscan and the Jesuit period may not have been successful in the context of, at the time, achieving a number of converts, simply documenting a mass conversion. But over the course of history, it has proven to be far more effective, as the Catholic faith is the predominant faith of the Tohono O'odham people, and also the predominant faith of the both Mexican and Mexican-American families that still consider this their mother church. So this remarkable church was built here by the native people. It was never completed. It was left. They ran out of money. They couldn't borrow any more funds. The Spanish Empire was starting to unravel. And so when the artisans left the church, they left much of the interior artwork unfinished. And you can see that today. Our conservators did not go back, repaint the frescoes or murals that were left unpainted. So you can see work in progress where obviously an artisan had put down their paintbrush and left the church. More importantly, however, the east tower of the church was never completed. And by that I mean, if you look at this church, you'll see one tower is complete with a dome, the other was left uncompleted. We know from a similar church in Mexico, the same architect intended to put 2 domes on this church. But more importantly, the east tower was never protected from the elements. So the East Tower, the fired brick, was left exposed to nature for over 120 years before Bishop Grandjohn arrived. And then one of the first things he did was he applied the white plaster, the white cement that gave this church the nickname the White Dove of the Desert. He protected and encased that tower. Here we are about 100 years later. We're in the process of restoring the East Tower, which means taking off anything that wasn't original. And when they get underneath that skin, they're going to find original 1790s brick, fired block. They have no idea how deteriorated it may be. It could be crumbling, it could be soft. And so our restoration team has to go in and replace each brick by hand. And if the brick is damaged, it needs to be removed. If it can be partially removed, it'll be partially removed. They don't use heavy equipment to do this. It's all manual, hand-skilled labor. We fire bricks in northern Sonora in the same technique that was used in the 1790s. So we have special bricks fired in an outdoor kiln. Then the church will be coated with a lime plaster mixture. And you can see it in a lot of the whiteness. The whiteness of the church is not paint, it's lime plaster. However, what they found, the key ingredient is they've rediscovered this artisanal ancient technique of incorporating the mucilage, the ingredient of prickly pear cactus, into the lime plaster. They boil it, mix it with the lime plaster, and that allows the church to actually breathe. And they had lost that technique. It has now been rediscovered. So once the brick are replaced, the East Tower will be plastered with the white lime plaster with the cactus juice mixture in it so that it'll breathe again, so that it won't suffer deterioration. And then the next major project after that is the facade, which is so unique for a church of this type, this very Rococo, Baroque, folk Baroque Spanish facade needs to be restored. It's at very grave risk of collapse. But beyond the transformation of the church, I think the key element to this church that I feel, and I hear from people who come here, is that being inside this church, there is a definite feeling of the presence of the Holy Spirit. And I hear that from people who tell me that they have no faith tradition, that have left a faith tradition. They can be Muslim, they can be Jewish, they can be Protestant. Anyone who comes through this church that I talk to about the church tells me that they definitely feel that there is a presence, that there's a spirit in this church. And it's remarkable when you spend time in this church that you step. Crossing from the front door of the church was described by the Franciscans as going from the world into the kingdom of heaven. And that's exactly how the church was designed to make people feel. To be emotional, to be overwhelming, to awe you with the power, the glory of the Catholic Church, but also the glory of God. And I have yet to meet anyone who comes through that door who tells me that they don't feel that presence. And I think in large part that's because of this extended history of this meeting of the Hispanic culture, the Anglo culture, and most importantly, the Tohono O'odham, the Native people culture. There's not a history of oppression or violence. There's a history in this community of acceptance, of working together, living together. And it's not a clash of culture, but I would call it a blending of culture. And so there's a culture of mutual respect, and it fills this church. You can see it in the love of the people who worship here, you can see it in the love of the people who work on the church, and you can see it in the love of the people who are helping preserve the church. There is a tangible feeling of that spirit within this church that it fills me whenever I come to this church.